So I hope you don't mind the difference on it. But these are things that have been on my heart for quite a while, and I just want to share with you the importance of Christians' involvement in the culture and even Christians' involvement in politics. And tonight's lesson is going to be a part one. I'm going to do part two next week. I thought about trying to do both of the views and myths of Christians and government. I thought about doing that both tonight, but then I got to realizing as I was putting things together that it was way too much, and I'm even afraid a little bit that I'm not going to be able to get through the views in time, but I'm going to try. I was telling Danny before church that it's so hard sometimes. You study and you find so much information. You can't possibly share everything that you have studied. And so the difficult part is compacting it, narrowing it down, and just focusing on a few things so that you aren't overwhelmed by a whole bunch of information. And so that's one of the difficulties that I have found with this particular study as I've been studying this. But this has to, tonight I will focus on the views, what Wayne Grudem calls the wrong views, the five wrong views of government, Christians and government. Next week, I want to talk about the four myths about Christians and politics. And this is is from a video series by Jeff Myers, who is the head of the Summit Ministries in Colorado Springs. And Summit Ministries trains young people mostly during the summer, trains them in biblical worldview so that they can go to their respective high schools and college campuses and with a biblical worldview in mind to be prepared to engage people in the world. And so I want to share with you some of the four different myths that he had. With both of these, I'm going to use them as launching points to talk about some of my own stuff. But I want you to know that the 5 points I'm going to deal with tonight do come from Grudem. I'm just borrowing the points and then I'll expand on it. And some of the things I'll say tonight come from Wayne Grudem. Some of them don't. But this comes from Wayne Grudem's book, The Politics According to the Bible. And I think I may have told you last week that it was God and Government or something like that, or Government and God or something. I can't remember what I said. But actually that's the title of Chuck Colson's book, and I misspoke. So this is Politics According to the Bible is where some of this information comes from. And so what I'm going to do is just jump right in here and talk about the five wrong views. These are wrong views that sometimes people have about Christians' involvement in politics and government, the whole shebang. And Grudem shares with us, shares in the book, he shares with people how they're wrong. But the first wrong view, I'll call them Grudem 1, Grudem 2, Grudem 3, so you know what they are. The first wrong view is government should compel religion. That the government, in essence, needs to establish a state religion, an official religion. And the reality is that no evangelical Christian, at least that I'm aware of, no evangelical Christian believes that the state ought to sponsor a religion, that a state-sponsored religion ought to be established. Nobody here in America really believes that. I'm not sure that anybody does. Even more liberal Christians, I don't think that they do either. But this is an accusation that's made sometimes against us as believers when we want to get involved in the political process. Oh, you're just trying to establish a state religion. No, we're not. We're not trying to establish a state religion. In fact, early American Christians fled Europe because of the state religions in European countries. And in fact, let me just say this, the 1619 Project is wrong. The United States was not founded upon slavery. It was founded on religious freedom. The vast majority of the people who came over initially to the colonies were people who were trying to flee religious persecution. And that's the reason why religious freedom is one of the foundations of the American government. My own ancestor, Johannes Spitler, who changed his name to John Spitler when he came to Virginia in the 1740s. John Spitler was a Mennonite in Switzerland, from Switzerland, and the state church in Switzerland persecuted Mennonites. I mean, to such an extent that there was one story that I saw in a documentary where two Mennonite pastors were walking down the street. They were taken into custody by people who, I don't know if they were rabble, if they were officials, but with both of them, rocks were tied around their ankles, and they were thrown into the river alive. And both of them drowned. And that sort of thing happened all the time. And so it was for religious freedom that John Spitler, along with a number of other Mennonites, came over to the colonies. And that is the reason why I say that we here in America just don't want a state religion. We don't want that. We want people to be free to worship, to have freedom of religion. In fact, we believe in freedom of religion for all. And that actually includes Jews, Muslims, Hindus. We believe, as a matter of principle, that everyone ought to have the freedom to worship as they choose. We understand, especially in Christianity, we understand that you can't force people to believe something they don't believe. We don't believe that you can take a sword and put it to people's throat and say, convert or die. And that has happened in history. I don't know if it still happens. Maybe in some countries the pressure is put on to where it's almost like a sword to the throat. I'm not sure about that. But here in America, we want people to freely choose to be Christians instead of being forced to be a Christian. I mean, nobody really likes to be forced to do anything. I mean, ever thought about that? I know when we were kids, we were forced to eat our greens, our vegetables. I love vegetables. So I never had a problem. My parents never had a problem forcing me to eat it. But you know how kids are. They refuse to do stuff that they don't want to do. But we as adults are sometimes the same way. We might resist when people say, we got to do this, you got to do this. So here in America, we do believe in freedom of religion. Now, I made a slip of the tongue a little while ago and I said freedom to worship as we please. Later on, I'm going to talk about the difference between freedom of religion and freedom of worship. Because there is a group, there are people out in America who use that term freedom of worship rather than freedom of religion, and they don't mean what we mean when we say freedom of religion. So that's one of the things that I'll talk about in a future lesson. So anyway, that's the first wrong view. The second wrong view that Grudem deals with is really the opposite, that government should exclude Christians or Christianity, should exclude religion in general. What they say, in essence, this position says that Christians should have no involvement or no say in government whatsoever. Now, of course, one of the problems with that is that that doesn't does not work here in the American system because we believe that individual citizens, whether they're religious or not, have the right to be involved in the political process and should be involved in the political process. So this particular view says that Christians shouldn't have any kind of say at all in public affairs. Now, unfortunately, there are Christians who actually believe this. They hold to this particular position. Unfortunately, I think that it's very few that do. And this particular position, if Christians do try to get involved, like for instance, they try to oppose any kind of proposition that's being made, things that, and they oppose it on moral grounds, the accusation is made again that we're trying to establish a state religion, and you Christians should keep your mouth shut. And it may be that some of the things that we oppose are on moral grounds. That may be true, but still we oppose them for particular reasons, and we oppose them not only because they're on moral ground, based on moral grounds, but we also oppose them because we can see what the results are going to be. Now, one particular issue that Christians have opposed greatly in recent years is the idea of same-sex marriage. And one of the reasons I wanted to mention this one in this particular issue is because Wayne Grudem mentions this one. Many states decided to legalize same-sex marriage in spite of what the people in that state wanted. And Grudem points out two different examples of this that I think are really interesting, things that I didn't know about or wasn't really aware of or had forgotten, at least with the Proposition 8. But in Iowa, only 24% of the people in Iowa were in favor of same-sex marriage, which means 76% of them did not want same-sex marriage and were vocal about not wanting same-sex marriage. Well, the Iowa Supreme Court decided those people didn't know what they were talking about, and they said, here in Iowa, we're going to allow same-sex marriage. Forget about the will of the people. The courts decided that they would allow same-sex marriage. Then Proposition 8 in California, I remember when all of that came down, this was years ago, it was in November of 2008, the election in November 2008, voters in California were given the opportunity to vote on this idea of the definition of marriage, the idea of same-sex marriage ultimately. And Proposition 8 said that marriage should be defined as between a man and a woman. Californians voted for it. They wanted Proposition 8. But then it was thrown out in the courts because the courts decided that the will of the people was not important. And so these are just two examples of that, and many of the people, many of the folks who suggested that the only reason Christians were opposed to these things were on moral grounds. They were trying to introduce religion into our country, and we can't have that. Well, it was more than just for religious reasons that we opposed, that many Christians opposed same-sex marriage. The Establishment Clause in the Constitution and the separation of church and state. I want to mention these two things here. They're kind of related. Every time Christians want to get involved or try to get involved in politics, we are accused of violating the U.S. Constitution. People will bring up the Establishment Clause and say you're violating the First Amendment, where it says you can't have a state religion, as if that's what we were trying to do. And then they will even bring up the whole idea of the separation of church and state, which, by the way, is not even in the Constitution. And I'm going to explain that in just a little bit. But as far as the Establishment Clause, I wanted to read to you the first part of the First Amendment of the Constitution. I got my trusty little Constitution booklet here. I want to read you the first part of it because I want you to hear what the Constitution is saying when it talks about this establishment clause in prohibiting the establishing of a state religion. And it says this in the First Amendment: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Congress won't make laws. Congress is not to determine that there will be a state religion. And also, Congress cannot make any law prohibiting the free exercise thereof, the free exercise of religion, or abridging the freedom of speech in the press, and he goes on. But you see, here, what the First Amendment clearly teaches, what it tells us, is that Congress is not to pass any laws regarding the establishing of a state religion. It has nothing to do with Christians as American citizens being involved in the political process. Has nothing to do with it whatsoever. And so they can't use this argument against us that when we want to get involved, we become actively involved in our culture and in our society and politics, they can't accuse us of violating the First Amendment. Now, as far as the separation of the church and state, that whole idea, those exact words are never found in the Constitution. And in fact, some of you may be aware of this. That phrase, the wall of separation between church and state, did not come until the time of Thomas Jefferson when he was president. And the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut had become concerned that the government was going to overreach its bounds and would get involved in the church's affairs. And so they were really concerned about that, and Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to the Danbury Association and reassured them that the government was not going to overstep its bounds and not get involved in the affairs of the church. And in fact, what he in essence said was that there are two different spheres. There's the sphere of government, there's the sphere of the church. And both spheres have their certain responsibilities. They have control over certain things, certain duties and responsibilities to the people that they serve, and that one would not interfere with the free exercise of the other. The government would not interfere in church business. The clergy would be the ones who would make decisions and that sort of thing, or the people would, in the case of congregational governments, right? And that the church, by the same token, would not have a direct control over the government like you would have seen, like we saw in medieval times when the Roman Catholic Church had control in strong political control in, say, in European countries. And so that idea, the whole idea of wall of separation, Jefferson was just simply saying there's a wall that separates the two spheres, and the two spheres are free to operate without interference from the other. But he was not saying that Christians could not, as citizens, be involved in a political process. So that argument really doesn't hold any kind of water whatsoever. Christians' involvement in our culture is really very important, and if for no other reason, to be the moral conscience of our society. You know, you've heard me talk about this before, over and over, I guess, maybe ad nauseum, about the relativism of our society and how people say that right and wrong is personally determined. You decide for yourself what's right and what's wrong. You decide what's good and what's moral, what immoral, good or evil. You're the one that decides that. And people in our society really don't have a basis to determine anything is good or evil. And I want to use an example that I came across as I was reading and getting preparing for these lessons. And it had to do with an interview that was done with the former CEO of Google. His name was Eric Schmidt. He was being interviewed on NPR radio, and it had to do with Google's motto that they used to use in the past, but guess what? They don't use it anymore. But the motto was, don't be evil, telling their employees, don't be evil. And in fact, they went as far as to say, if you see evil things happening within the company, then you're required to say something. Well, they had to back off on that motto. And the reason was because they couldn't determine what evil was. And in fact, here's a quote from Eric Schmidt that will kind of just boggle your mind. Google and boggle, isn't that sort of similar? It'll Google your mind. He said this, there's no book about evil except, the Bible, maybe, the Bible or something. I thought that was very interesting. He's making an admission that there is an objective standard. There is a book that tells you what evil is. But he doesn't want to admit that. And then in the same interview, he goes on to say that not being able to define evil is actually a virtue. He called it a virtue, something that's good. It's wonderful that we can't clearly define what evil is, because evil is personally determined. You decide for yourself what's good and what's evil. But here's the problem with that kind of thinking. What Adolf Hitler said, we would have to say that what Adolf Hitler said and did was not evil. For him, it was good. It was a virtue. What Stalin did in murdering millions and millions of people, many more people than what Hitler and the Nazis did during World War II times. What Stalin did wasn't evil, because he thought what he was doing was right in eliminating political enemies and anybody that he found undesirable or would not get with the program of communism. And so that's a real problem. And so when I say that Christians need to be the moral conscience of our society, I don't say that lightly, because somebody has to speak up and say, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, this is what's good, this is what's evil. Somebody has to do that. And I'll tell you, if we don't do that, and we allow the world to determine, to continue in their relativism, and the world, our government and this country will become more and more evil. Somebody has to say something. Anyway, okay. All right, let me move on to the next point. I think I'm getting ahead of myself with some of the stuff that I want to talk about. Let me go ahead and talk about the third wrong view of government and Christians in government. And Grudem identifies this as the view that all government is evil and demonic. And some Christians actually do believe this, and I understand why. I mean, we look at Washington, D.C. right now, and, some people call it the swamp. I've gotten to where I want to call it the cesspool, because there's just so much corruption and I'm always wondering what's going to happen. How are we going to be able to clean up all of this mess? It's so evil that people in high positions of positions of power are extremely evil. And I just want to get discouraged. Now, this particular position actually comes, according to Grudem, from a misunderstanding of Luke chapter 4 and verse 6. And this is it's in the passage where Luke talks about Jesus being tempted of the devil 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. And I want to read you just a few of the verses here just to kind of set the context for it and tell you why Grudem said this is a misunderstanding. And I tend to agree with him. You may disagree with him on what I'm going to say, on the position that he made, the point that he makes. But this is what ESV says in Luke 4, verses 5 through 7. And the devil took him up and showed him took Jesus up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time, and said to him, "To you I will give all this authority and their glory, for it has been delivered to me, and I will give it to whom I will. If you then will worship me, it will all be yours." Now, I have a question. I question some of the things he says. Two things that the devil said to him. First of all, I question that all that authority was given to him. Who gave him that authority? Is he just taking that upon himself? I read in the New Testament that God has given Jesus the authority of the nations and has placed everything under the feet of Jesus. And yet the devil's saying, it's mine. It's mine. But then he says it's been delivered up to him, like it's been freely given to him by God. Now, the point that Grudem makes on this, Grudem makes the point that Satan is a liar, the father of lies. And when he lies, when he speaks, he will speak his native language of lying. And so the question that Grudem brings up that I think is a good question, was Satan telling the truth here? Maybe he was lying. And now some people will say, well, wait a minute. If he was lying, then Jesus would have called him on it and say, listen, Satan, that's not true, and you know it. But Grudem makes the point that the focus here, that when Luke is telling us of the temptation of Jesus, the focus really is on how Jesus is overcoming temptation. That's the focus. And I will also say this, and I've always believed this, Jesus was tempted 40 days and 40 nights. I don't think there were just 3 temptations. Those are the only 3 that were mentioned. And I think it was like John at the end of his gospel said, I suppose that if all the volumes of the world couldn't contain everything that Jesus said and did. And I agree with that. And I think that it is totally possible, it's highly likely that Jesus was tempted over and over and over throughout that entire 40-day period. And I think that we just get little snippets of what went on in the exchange between Jesus and Satan. And maybe Jesus initially resisted the temptation and then later said to Satan, "You're wrong, fellow." I don't know. Maybe I don't know how Jesus would address Satan. Now, if this particular position were true, that all governments are evil, then Grudem makes this very good point. How could we then tell if a government is a good government? How could we make a distinction between good governments and evil governments? You think about back in the olden days, and the days of the kings of Israel and Judah. Well, it's only with the kings of Judah, by the way, that the writers would say this. But in the days of the kings of Judah, the writers always made a point of telling us if the king did evil in the eyes of the Lord, if the king did good in the eyes of the Lord. He's always telling us that. Well, if all governments are evil, and all governments were handed over to Satan at the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve sinned, then there would be no way for the Old Testament writers to say that any government was a good government. And we know throughout history that there have been governments that have been good. So this particular position may not actually hold up under scrutiny. Now, also the purpose of government, and I was going to deal with this. Let me see what I have up there. I can't read this. Okay, restrains evil. All right, I was thinking about changing that, and I can't remember that I did. I need binoculars when I'm up here because I can't read it from there. I got it in my notes, but sometimes I make changes. This passage in Romans chapter 13, I want to read this real quickly. And boy, I'm not sure I'm going to get through everything. I'll do super fast here. Romans 13, starting at verse 1. I'm just going to read a few verses. Romans 13:1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. I don't want to talk about submission to government right now. I'll deal with that once later on, because I do believe that there can come a time when Christians have to oppose a government that's evil, but I'll talk about that in another lesson. In verse 3, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. But if all governments are evil, then why isn't the world's government going to be a terror to evil? You know, they're not going to be looking for the good. They don't care. And so, would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good. Well, what's good? And you will receive his approval, the official's approval. For he is God's servant for your good. And there's that word good again. But if you do wrong or evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. So if all governments are evil, then, and under the control of Satan, why in the world would they punish evildoers? Satan wouldn't want evildoers to be punished. You know, he didn't want Adolf Hitler to be punished. You know, Hitler was doing his business. And so this particular view really doesn't hold up at all. And just as a kind of as a sideline, that God establishes government God does establish civil government to restrain evil, but God also uses the transforming gospel of Jesus Christ as a way of restraining evil. Those are two ways that God uses to restrain evil in the world. Because, you know, there's a verse of Scripture that says that when that which, if I can remember the correct wording of it, you know, when the righteous ones are taken out of the way, then there won't be any restraint of evil. I can't remember the wording of it exactly, but Pastor Kirk talked about that stuff with Revelation last year. But at any rate, when people are transformed by the gospel of Jesus Christ, that, in essence, is restraining of evil in our society. So, anyway, let me go ahead and move on here to the next point. And the next one is that Grodum's fourth wrong view of government and Christians. This one you might disagree with him on, but just hear him out here. Do evangelism, not politics. Now, the problem with this one is that not politics. It suggests that you don't do politics at all, only concentrate on evangelism, on preaching the gospel. People like John MacArthur and the Christian journalist Cal Thomas hold to this particular position. MacArthur in particular, MacArthur said, don't get involved in the politics, just preach the gospel. That's our only responsibility. And I understand that position, because people do need to have their hearts changed. There needs to be an inward change before there's an outward change. And politics only takes care of stuff on the outside, and it doesn't take care of stuff on the inside. But Grudem comes up with a definition of the gospel that I think is very interesting. And Grudem says this, and this is a direct quote from his book. You're free to disagree with him, but he offers some interesting insight on this, and I'll qualify that definition just a little bit here in a minute. But he says the gospel in the New Testament is not just trust in Jesus and be forgiven of your sins and grow in holiness and go to heaven. It's not just that, he says. The gospel is God's good news, and you see the italicized words, that's emphasis is his, about all of life, exclamation point, and that's his emphasis as well. This is directly from Grudem's book. Now, when you look at this, you think that maybe he's saying that the gospel's not that important, but that's not what he's saying. It is true. The first part is absolutely true and is absolutely necessary. But he's making the point that the gospel is supposed to transform us so that we live out the gospel in the world. And we have an influence on people in the world. And we have an influence on the institutions in the world. We have an influence on our governments, on our educational institutions. We have an influence. We have a say in all that. And we are to influence them for the good, being the moral compasses of our culture. And that's the point. That's how he looks at this whole idea of the gospel. And really there's some truth to that it is supposed to transform us so that we can live out that gospel in our lives, and people will be drawn to faith through that. Now, he goes in also in this chapter, and I want to go ahead and move on here because he goes on to also talk about some of the ways that Christians have influenced their societies. And I want to go down through a quick list here. He talks about a couple of things in particular. He talks about North and South Korea, for instance, real quickly on that. He doesn't deal with it to some extent, to a great extent. Jeff Myers talks about this as well. In South Korea, freedom of religion. It's a democracy, very similar to America, and they have freedom of religion. The Christian church is prospering in South Korea. You know that one of the largest churches in the world, at least in the 80s, the largest church in the world, was in Seoul, South Korea, pastored by Paul Young-gi Cho. And he might be dead by now for all I know, but it's just been phenomenal growth in the church in South Korea. They have sent missionaries everywhere in the world, including to America, which I think we really need. That's kind of surprising. But they've sent missionaries to Nepal, and I've met some of those South Korean missionaries to Nepal. But then you contrast that with the country of North Korea. And as Grudem has pointed out, and I think Jeff Myers talks about this as well, Christianity in North Korea has just about been extinguished, has been extinct, because it's a brutal regime that really persecutes Christians. That's one example of how Christians have had an influence. But then in the Roman Empire, this is a real interesting list, and I'm going to go down through the list real quickly because I don't have much more time, and I may not get through all of this week. I think I might just go down through this list and talk about this and leave the next point of the last point I'll say for next week, because I'm running out of time here. But Christianity has influenced the Roman Empire in many different ways. Christians were instrumental in the outlawing of infanticide, the killing of babies, which was a little bit different than abortion, and abortion's listed there. This was the outright, what one ethicist in America, Peter Singer, calls for. He believes that parents should have the right to take the children's life up until the age of 3 years old. And yes, I said years old. This is the kind of practice that was going on in Rome. And Christians were instrumental in bringing that to an end. The child abandonment, many of the Christians, I don't know if you know about this, but when babies or even young children would be abandoned by their parents because if the Roman father didn't want a child, throw them out on the streets. Christians would come along and take those babies and take those children and raise them as their own, teach them the gospel, and they grew up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And in fact, many of now I remember hearing somebody say this, I don't remember who it was, but they were talking about girl babies in particular were cast out into the streets because the Roman father wanted a son. They wanted sons. They didn't want daughters. And so here these Christians would take in these baby girls. These girls would grow up knowing the Lord. And then the Roman boys would come looking for a wife. But the only ones available were Christian girls. And so the Christian girls were an influence on these Roman boys once they got married. And that's part of the way that the gospel was spread through the Roman Empire. I like that kind of story. Christians also were helped in bringing to an end the brutal gladiatorial games, which were not like our modern boxing matches, where you win, one person might win by points, the other, or might win by a knockout or a technical knockout. No, the winner was the one who was left standing, still alive. The loser was dead. And they brought that to an end. They helped to bring to an end the criminal's punishment of branding on the faces. I didn't know about this particular one. I'd like to know a little bit more. What did they put on the face and whatever? But anyway, they were instrumental in bringing about prison reforms, including the segregation of women and men. Women were put in with men for a long time, and I shudder to think what these women prisoners went through, the brutality they experienced at the hands of men. But that was just a horrible, horrible thing. But this was the influence on the Roman Empire. Now, Christians had other influences through the centuries in other places. They also were instrumental in stopping the practice of human sacrifice by the Irish, the Prussians, and the Lithuanians, who were followers of pagan religions. The Irish in particular were Celtic. And what's really interesting, and I don't know if any of you know about this, some of the paganism and the Wicca stuff is starting to make a comeback. These paganisms of Europe, of old Europe, the ones that did believe in sacrifice. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to start doing human sacrifices here in this country, but that's on the rise. That's a lot of people are wanting to be spiritual, and they're seeking for something spiritual and different, and unfortunately, they're exploring paganism. Christians were responsible for the outlawing of pedophilia, and I need to just really be frank with you on this one. There are people in our country who are fighting to repeal these pedophilia laws. They want adults to be able to have sexual relations with children. There are some that are calling for that, and it's time for Christians to stand up and say, no. Christians have done that in the past, and we need to do it again. Now, he also mentions that Christians were the ones that led the charge in property rights, giving of property rights and other rights to women. I will say this, that even as in early Christianity elevated the status of women, and I don't have time to develop that thought. Maybe in a future session, if you wanted me to go through that, I could develop it for you. But then also in other countries, they work to stop polygamy and return, bring about monogamy. Then in India in particular, Christians were responsible for stopping the custom of burning of widows, William Carey was horrified when he first went to India. I started to say England, came from England to India. But he was horrified when he saw a man that had died put on a funeral pyre to be cremated, and his widow, alive, was put on the fire with him. That was a custom that they had. And so Christian influence brought an end to that. And then some of you may be familiar with this, but Christians also had an influence in China by helping to bring about the end of the practice of crippling girls by binding their feet. Their legs were tied together so that their legs were only like this far apart. And I've seen some of the movies on it. And they were forced to wear these shoes that in essence curled their toes and made their feet very, very small. And Christians were able to help bring about the end of that practice. And Grudem gives a date of about like 1912, something like that. Because there was a great revival that took place in China before the communists came in. So that gets through four of the wrong views about Christians and politics. And I'll start off with this fifth one next week, and I'll talk about the four myths that Jeff Myers talked about in his presentation. So anyway, let's go ahead and pray, and then I want to make one quick comment about the note cards. But let's go ahead and pray. Lord, I pray for your helping us grasping all of these different things. There's so many things, Lord, and I feel so inadequate in bringing all of the stuff across that I've studied. But I pray that the passion of this would come across to everyone, Lord. Impress upon all of us, Lord, the importance of us being involved in the world that you have created. And I know that your intention is for us to be a blessing to the nations and even to our own nation. And so I pray that you would instruct us. Teach us where we err, where we go wrong in our understanding about the nature of government, politics, and our role in it. I just pray that you would just open up our eyes and open up our hearts, give us understanding. We are so grateful to you that you have blessed us with a good country. And I pray, Father, for the future of this country, that I pray that people would, that your hearts would be open to you. Lord, do a work in the hearts of people and to turn people back to you, Lord. And remind us, Lord, what the verse says, if your people who are called by your name will humble themselves and pray and seek your face and turn from their wicked ways, then you will hear from heaven and forgive their sin and heal their land. And we need our land to be healed, Lord. Please do a work in us, oh God, and do a work in our country. In Jesus' name, amen.